here to talk to us today is Ardi Imseis. Thanks for being with us, Ardi.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Wissam.
Can you briefly tell us about the history of the establishment of the UNRWA? Why was it a different entity from the UNHCR? And what other agencies were established for the Palestinians around the same time?
Sure. Great question. People often wonder why there is a refugee agency specific to Palestinian refugees, or as the agency, UNRWA, calls them, Palestine Refugees. And the reason for that is because of the unique role played by the United Nations in the creation of the Palestine problem at the United Nations. So in order to understand that, we need to go back to the events of November 29, 1947, when the General Assembly of the United Nations, then dominated by the Western states, the General Assembly only amounted at the time to maybe 50, 51 states, dominated by the West, decided without consultation with the Palestinian indigenous population of Palestine, decided to recommend partition of Palestine in violation of the Palestinian people's right under international law then to self-determination in the whole of Palestine, in line with relevant international law applicable to Class A mandated territories. It's rather detailed. I don't know if you really want to get into that, but all this to say, the Western states persisted in recommending the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state in former Palestine, the terms of which were patently unreasonable and unfair, and also violative of international law. For instance, the purported Jewish state would make up of about 56% of the total of Palestine's land, but the Jewish population of Palestine at the time only numbered 1/3 of the whole. Likewise, the idea that there, in the partition resolution, that there should be two states, and that and both of those states should be democratic, and the rule of law should apply with equal rights as between all parties living in the territory, regardless of their nationality or their religion and so on. The population ratio in the Jewish state made that impossible. So the purported Jewish state, or the proposed Jewish state, would include a population of some 495,000 or 490,000 Jews to 510,000 Palestinian Arabs. So how would you have a democratic state in this purported Jewish state in which the Jews would be a minority relative to the indigenous Palestinian Arab population? So for all of these reasons, at the time of the discussion in the General Assembly in August, September, and early November 1947 took place regarding whether or not Palestine should be partitioned, the small number of non-European states argued, including some Arab states, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, but also Iran, India, Pakistan, and so on. They argued with the Western majority that this idea to partition Palestine against the interests of and the rights of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population would give rise to war. And they warned that as a result of that war, catastrophe would befall the Palestinian people. The General Assembly persisted, and they adopted the partition plan. And 3 days after the partition plan was adopted, on 29 November 1947, war broke out in Palestine, as was warned. For the first 6 months of the 1948 war, what is known as the 1948 war, there were no Arab states that were involved in that conflict, during which time 300,000 Palestinian Arabs were ethnically cleansed from what would become the Jewish state. By 14 May, when the Yishuv, the Zionist Jewish population of Palestine, declared their independence in the territory and established the State of Israel by this declaration, which was recognized by a few states, including the United States and the USSR and others, that began a new phase of the war where Arab states, surrounding Arab states, entered Palestine effectively to save it from its dismemberment. The war continued for another approximately 12 months, during which time another 450,000 to maybe 550,000 thereabouts Palestinian Arabs were ethnically cleansed from Palestine. So by the time of the war's end, say April, May, June, and the signing of the armistice agreements in 1949, the matter had returned, the question of Palestine had returned to the General Assembly, the same General Assembly that acted in the way that they did to partition Palestine against international law and against the interests of the indigenous population, the majority population. And so the debate became one of, well, from the global south countries, we told you so, we told you that this would happen, now what? And so the United Nations General Assembly created the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. It also established the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine. So UNRWA and the UNCCP were two bodies that were created by the General Assembly as an expression, if you like, of the United Nations responsibility for what had taken place in Palestine. And oftentimes, even to this day, when criticisms are made of the United Nations purportedly undue focus on the situation in Palestine, the number of bodies that are UN bodies that are focused on Palestine or UN commissions of inquiry. Whenever these critiques are leveled against the UN for focusing inordinately on Palestine, what is often left out is this history that I've just recited over the past few minutes of the UN's direct responsibility for the creation of the Palestine refugee problem and the Palestinian refugee problem. And this, if you understand this history, you can understand why the Palestinian issue would be so important for the UN. So this is the background. Now, so UNRWA is created by the General Assembly to deal with the humanitarian impact, right? Provide humanitarian relief and social services and so on to the refugees of the conflict. That's on the one hand, the humanitarian protection and assistance. And UNCCP was created to deal with what we call durable solutions, even though that was not the term used at the time, but to deal with the durable solutions for the Palestine refugee problem through political negotiations. All of this contrasts with another United Nations body that was created around the same time and began its operations in 1950, created in 1950 and also began its operations in 1950, just shortly after UNRWA began its operations. And this is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. And oftentimes people wonder why there's two different bodies, one for all refugees on earth, UNHCR, with the exception of Palestinian or Palestine refugees, UNRWA. And so I've tried to just set out now the rationales to why there are two different bodies, and it goes to the UN's direct responsibility for the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem to begin with. But one thing that you should know, and your listeners should know as well, is that that was not out of the ordinary at the time. So that is to say, whenever there was a refugee problem that was created as a result of wars in Europe, largely, but during the interwar period or even before, the international community would establish ad hoc refugee bodies. UNHCR was one such body, and if you look at UNHCR and its mandate, it is temporally and geographically limited. Temporally limited initially to events, refugees that emerge from events that take place before 1951, basically World War II, and geographically limited to Europe. And it wasn't until 1967 that the UNHCR regime shed these geographical and temporal limitations, thereby becoming a universal regime. And in the meantime, UNRWA operations, which begin in May 1950 in various areas in the Middle East, which I'll talk about in a moment, are focusing on the refugees that emerged as a result of the 1948 war. So where does UNRWA operate? Well, UNRWA was mandated and has continued to be mandated by the General Assembly to operate in what we call 5 areas of operation. So that would be the occupied Gaza Strip, the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and then Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So you'll note Syria, Lebanon, Jordan being the immediate transit countries for Palestinian refugees as a result of the 1948 war. And the key services provided by the agency to Palestine refugees, generations of Palestine refugees since 1950, are largely threefold. The core services are, first, education, primary education. About 70% of the agency's budget is spent on educating millions of Palestinian refugees. Then about 20% of the budget is spent on providing primary health care across these 5 areas of operation. And then finally, the remainder of the budget is spent on what the agency calls relief and social services, which are basically food aid and social welfare services to people who are destitute, who are refugees who are destitute, and so on. And these are the core services. In addition to the core services, in times of emergency, like that which we see now, say, in Gaza or in Lebanon or indeed in Syria, the agency has kicked in emergency services, not only to Palestine refugees, but to other Palestinians and persons of concern who the agency feels like it needs to provide humanitarian aid and assistance to. So UNRWA plays an extremely important role in providing support, humanitarian support, and these quasi-governmental supports to generations of Palestinian refugees. But one of the things that UNRWA doesn't do is offer durable solutions, by which is meant in international refugee law practice, looking for a political solution for the refugee problem, right? And that was vested in effect in the UNCCP, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, which began its work following the passage of Resolution 194 in, I think it would be December 1949, began its work trying to solve the Palestine question in the context of mediated efforts of negotiations between the newly formed state of Israel and the Arab states that went to war with it in the 1948 war. And through mediation, you're effectively trying to bridge gaps between these parties. And there were a number of mediation talks held in Europe in the early 1949, 50, 51, 52. But by 1953, the mediation just breaks down. The parties to the conflict can't agree on how to resolve their issues, including the Palestinian refugee issue. The Israelis initially say, we'll accept 100,000 refugees of the anywhere between 750 to 900,000 refugees that were ethnically cleansed. And they withdrew that offer very, very quickly when the Arab states continued to press and say, no, a condition to discussing things with you over larger, broader issues will be that you accept the right of the Palestinian refugees to return to their properties, their homes, and so on, which is affirmed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in Resolution 194 that created UNCCP, and as well affirmed in general practice of international law concerning refugees. All this to say there could not be a meeting of the minds. And so the UNCCP from about 1952 shifted the focus of its work from mediation between the parties to documenting, verifying, and recording the scope of Palestinian refugee losses, rights and losses. So basically property losses, movable and immovable property, bank accounts, cars, homes, land, orange groves, you name it, everything. And then to document that in the UN record. And then as well as lost opportunities as well, that we've lost future opportunities that they didn't really get into too much, but you can appreciate their record would be useful in establishing that as well. They finished this documentation in around 1962-63, and since then the UNCCP has remained in abeyance. It formally continues to exist, but it reports annually to the General Assembly, to whom it reports, that it regrets that it has nothing further to report. I mean, it's literally a one-line report. And that's that. So all of this means that because UNCCP was unable to establish or find a durable solution in the first 2 or 3 years of its existence through negotiations between the parties for the Palestinian refugee problem, There is no United Nations organization today that focuses on finding a durable solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. That is what we call in international refugee law, and those who do work on Palestine, a huge protection gap. In contrast, the UNHCR has a mandate both to provide aid and assistance and registration to refugees, right, to be counted as refugees as such, which UNRWA does as well for Palestinian refugees. But it also has a mandate to focus on durable solutions and finding durable solutions for refugees that they serve. And in international refugee law and practice, the durable solutions are threefold. Based on that practice, the most preferred solution, and one that is most often used and invoked in practice, is voluntary repatriation, right? Which is obvious when people are ethnically cleansed or they have a well-founded fear of persecution in relation to a place that they are a national or in which they were formerly habitually resident. Ideally, they would normally want to go back to their homes, go back to their communities, and so on. So it makes sense that voluntary repatriation would be the preferred solution. The second solution would be resettlement in an initial country of refuge, right? And then third would be resettlement in the third country, right? Those are the three durable solutions that UNHCR operates on and that international refugee lawyers do operate on. There is this protection gap on durable solutions by virtue of this unique institutional and normative framework or regime focused on Palestinian refugees. It gets rather detailed beyond that. I think I'll stop there and allow you to ask another question or continue the conversation.
No, that's amazing. Thanks a lot. It's it covers a lot of what I actually wanted to ask after that. But I wanted to get specifically into the Israeli ban on UNRWA. And you mentioned that UNRWA operates in occupied West Bank and occupied Gaza. So what does banning UNRWA now, what does it mean for the Palestinians that are in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza? What would that mean to them, the banning? And who would provide their humanitarian assistance?
That's right. So a couple of things to note. Israel has been in occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, otherwise known as the Occupied Palestinian Territory, since June 1967. And as an occupying power under international law, it is Israel that has the obligation to provide humanitarian aid and assistance, what is generally referred to in international humanitarian law as relief schemes, we'll call it that, to the protected population, in this case, the Palestinian population. But immediately after the war ended, the Six-Day War that took place in 1967, during which Israel took control over the occupied Palestinian territory, the Israelis entered into an agreement with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. And this agreement is a bilateral exchange of letters called, in shorthand, the Comey-Micklemore exchange of letters, in which the Israelis invite UNRWA to continue to discharge its obligations to the Palestinian refugee population in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, which it had been doing since May 1950, thereby relieving Israel of the economic burden of having to provide for these people. UNRWA has been operating in that territory since 1967 and has been relieving the occupying power of this financial, if you like, burden. 2 weeks ago, the Israeli government, or I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Israeli government, the Knesset passed two laws on UNRWA, withdrawing from the exchange of letters, the Comey-Micklemore exchange of letters, and basically declaring that agreement null and void. So removing the privileges and immunities of UNRWA as a United Nations organization, and then we can get into what that means legally. And also making it illegal or unlawful under Israeli law for any Israeli official, government official, military or civilian, from engaging with UNRWA. Now, why does that matter? Well, You can imagine, because the Israeli occupying power is so thoroughly in control of the occupied territory, nothing gets done in that territory without some authority of the Israeli government. So agency officials need to traverse hundreds of checkpoints that are erected by the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, across the occupied territory. And when they go through these checkpoints, they show their agency ID cards. They're also driving agency, again, when I say agency, I mean UNRWA vehicles, which attract privileges and immunities. Now these soldiers can't even speak to these people as though they're UN officials. They will not give them the right to pass through these checkpoints, and thereby report to duty, either as teachers or doctors or what have you. So because the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem are covered in hundreds of these checkpoints, you can see that once this legislation takes effect, which happens in about 2.5 months from now, the operational space of the agency in the West Bank and East Jerusalem will become shrinked thereby rather rapidly. Now in the Gaza Strip, it is exponentially worse. Do you remember when I said what UNRWA's core services were? Education, healthcare, and so on, and its relief operations and its emergency operations, food aid and food distributions and other such, healthcare, health clinics and emergency health care and so on. In the Gaza Strip, there has since the 7th of October been a complete collapse of all local government authority. And so UNRWA, being the UN organization that has an extremely wide reach in terms of its provision of what we call quasi-governmental services. There are 13,000 staff across the Gaza Strip, agency staff, teachers, doctors, and so on, sanitation workers, healthcare workers, and so on. If they can't procure get goods that they need to discharge humanitarian functions, food, water, fuel, all of that, then and they require assistance through the Israeli government to do that because they have to coordinate all the importation of those things. If international staff of the agency cannot get into the Gaza Strip to help coordinate and manage the humanitarian operation there because no Israeli authorities are authorized to grant them access through visa provision and other such, then you're looking at a complete collapse of UNRWA operations in the Gaza Strip. And the reason why it matters is because of what we know is taking place in the Gaza Strip. On the 26th of January of this year, the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, determined that there is a risk, a real and substantial risk, that the rights of the Palestinian people of the Gaza Strip to be free from acts of genocide under the Genocide Convention exists. And that gives rise to obligations of all states, including Israel, to prevent genocide from taking place. And the Israelis have persisted in their course of conduct in starving the population, bombarding the population. Famine is setting in with that population. They're being ethnically cleansed from their homes. Their homes are being destroyed through a scorched earth tactic. All 20 of Gaza's universities have been destroyed. 70% or thereabouts of the housing stock of Gaza have been destroyed. 233 UNRWA staff members have been killed. 70% of all UNRWA installations, I believe, or thereabouts, are either destroyed or damaged. So you're looking at a situation of apocalyptic character. And in that context, when the court has also said, the ICJ has also told Israel that it is under an obligation, this was by an order of, I think, 26 March of the year, and then reaffirmed again on the 4th of May, has told Israel that it has an obligation to provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip and to scale, right? At this time, by this legislation being passed, it's the complete reverse. The Israelis are doubling down on starving the population and making it impossible for them to live there. And the fear is, by destroying UNRWA's presence in the Gaza Strip, in effect, this is yet another piece, and a very important piece, in the continued ethnic cleansing of the territory. Nobody knows where it will go, but that's the general lay of the land.
And what does Israel hope to achieve by banning UNRWA?
Well,
I mean,
in the immediate term, as I mentioned, it's very clear that the Israelis want to make Gaza unlivable. There are large segments of the Israeli population, by the governing class, as well as the population, to be sure, but the governing class, members of cabinet, they're openly calling for the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, the removal of all 2.3 million Palestinians that live in Gaza from that territory. So, and others are now beginning to plan for settling the territory with Jewish settlers and so on. So the ethnic cleansing of the territory, along with a plausible genocide, tells you what some segments of Israeli government are aiming for. But in the larger, sort of less immediate course, one can see that Israel has another interest at play in trying to get rid of UNRWA, and that is to attack, to impugn, and ultimately to strip, at least in their view, the refugee status of the Palestinian refugee population that UNRWA serves. UNRWA has about 5.8 million Palestinian refugees on its rolls, its registration rolls. As I said earlier, they live in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. And so long as UNRWA exists, and this is sort of, so goes the argument in Israel's sense, so long as UNRWA continues to exist, in their view, the Palestinian refugees continue to exist. And if they continue to exist, they have claims, and their claims to property, to return, and so on need to be dealt with. And I think Israel's long-term concern in trying to undermine UNRWA's existence is to somehow undermine the existence and the refugee status and the refugee rights and claims of Palestinian refugees. That is what I think they're hoping for. I think they'll fail in that last regard. Israel, as a member state of the United Nations, does not have control over the existence of UNRWA. It can certainly get in the way of UNRWA's operations in the occupied territory. That's clear. But it can't end UNRWA, nor can it end the refugee status of the Palestinian refugees whom UNRWA supports, or their claims. Even if UNRWA were to disband tomorrow, those refugees would still be refugees under international law. They would still have rights to return. They would still have rights to property and restitution of their property, real and personal. They would still have all of those rights under international law. So there's a limitation to what Israel's ultimate goals may be in this respect. But these are the two things the Israelis are looking to do. One, attack UNRWA, and through UNRWA, the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip in particular, in terms of its ability to give humanitarian aid and keep the population in place in the occupied territory, but especially in Gaza, to attack refugee status of the Palestinian refugees, and ultimately the unique institutional and regulatory framework created by the UN to support those refugees by virtue of the UN's permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine.
Is it linked in any way to their strategy to alienate and attack the UN? Bombing the schools and whatever theatrics that happen in...
Certainly it's part of that. I would say that the UNRWA concern precedes that which we're seeing take place in recent years. The Secretary General, for instance, has been declared by Israel to be persona non grata, which really makes little sense. He has no plans on going to Israel in any case. But it's a political statement. The Israeli government has repeatedly called the General Assembly a circus. The Israeli government has taken issue with the International Court of Justice seizing jurisdiction on various cases that it is now entertaining or has entertained concerning Israel-Palestine. And by
shredding the
issue,
UN Charter.
Yeah, shredding the UN Charter. It's called the ICJ's engagement, a part of jihad, war of Israel demonization. That was a statement made by the Israeli permanent representative to Israel in October 2022. So yes, there is clearly a position that Israel has, a concern that they have with the United Nations. Their concern is articulated in in the way that suggests that the UN is an anti-Semitic organization and focuses unduly and ultimately unfairly all of the attention on Israel. But what that story misses is that it does not deal with the substance of what UN reporting about what Israel is doing in the occupied territory in particular, or vis-a-vis Palestinian refugees in particular, says. It doesn't deal with the international law violations that the UN has repeatedly reported and asked and insisted that Israel abide by. It doesn't deal with the substance. It's basically name calling. Nor does it treat seriously what Israel knows, which is the unique responsibility, as I'd said earlier, that the UN has in respect of the creation of the Palestinian problem, and as a result of this responsibility, the obligation to resolve it in line with international law.
And all this started early on with an allegation of UNRWA links to terrorists. And you see a lot of parroting in Western media, and as well as members of parliament in Canada. They applauded when McPherson was asking the question about this, I think last month. I mean, it started with that allegation, but there has been no proof on that, right? There's been...
Yeah, so for your listeners, I don't know if you would have said this at the beginning of our chat, but as you know, I served as legal counsel to UNRWA for many years. I served with UNRWA as a UN official for 12 years. I spent 4 years in the Gaza Strip and 7 years as the head of their legal office in East Jerusalem. And as a result, am well aware of the spurious allegations which regularly come from the Israeli authorities regarding the alleged improprieties of agency officials, including so-called engagement with terrorism and other such. And I can say that when the Israelis came out with their allegation that some 9 UNRWA staff members were engaged in the atrocities that took place on the 7th of October in southern Israel, I wasn't at all surprised that the Israeli government would come with that allegation. What I was waiting for, and what I knew would not come, and what indeed has not come, is any proof of the allegation itself. One of the problems, however, is that once the allegation is made, I think it was made on the 25th of January, or it was made public on the 25th of January, maybe 27th of January, forgive me, 2024. Once the allegation was made, the agency found itself in a very difficult position. So you have a situation in the Gaza Strip where there's an ongoing war, and not really a war, it's an assault on the civilian population. They're being starved and bombarded and so on. The agency's the only humanitarian aid agency capable of meeting this challenge in the moment. And Western states begin to pull their funds from the agency by virtue of the allegation being made. So it's a challenge. What people don't know, what the general public just doesn't know, is that under the administrative law of the United Nations, the Commissioner General has the authority to take any decision he wishes in the interests of the agency. And so what he did in the face of this challenge, when these allegations were made by the Israelis, was to fire these staff members from their jobs without the benefit of evidence in front of him as to the allegations themselves, which gave the impression globally that somehow they were engaged in the events of 7 October. But that's an incorrect impression to have, because he has the authority to take any decision in the interest of the agency, which he did. And immediately, in furtherance of the point that I'm making, when he did take that decision, he handed the file over to the Secretary General and the United Nations Office for Oversight of Internal Services, which is basically an internal investigative body, but separate from UNRWA. And he said, please investigate. So he fired them to assuage concerns of member states like the Western states regarding these allegations of impropriety, in order to maintain their support, which he needed and which the agency needed to continue the humanitarian relief operations of the agency for 2.3 million people in Gaza. And and handed the investigation over to the United Nations in New York. They did their investigation. Indeed, a second party, the Colonna report, came in, headed up by Mrs. Colonna. She was formerly a foreign minister of France, or in their foreign ministry, I can't quite recall. And she did her report as well. And these reports gave UNRWA a clean bill of health. They said very clearly that there's no evidence to prove that the allegations against these staff members are in fact true. And so the agency did the most prudent thing. In fact, they have a zero tolerance policy for political activity of staff members. In this case, they went well beyond that zero tolerance policy by firing these people without any evidence. And they did so because of the interests of the agency in providing aid and assistance to people on the ground. And notwithstanding that action and the prudence of the Commissioner General, Western states pulled their money, making it very, very difficult for the agency to operate. Now, one last point on this. What's interesting is that these allegations against the staff members, these 9 staff members who are alleged to have committed these atrocities or participated in the atrocities of 7 October, which were heinous, of course, came public less than 24 hours after the International Court of Justice issued its first provisional measures ruling in the South Africa v. Israel case under the Genocide Convention, and in which the court said that it is plausible and that there is a risk of the Palestinian population suffering genocide in the territory. So at exactly the same time that the news story in the world ought to have been the plausibility that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip, these allegations are made by Israel publicly, thereby changing the news narrative for the remainder of the week, if you like, and focused on UNRWA as the purveyor or the provider of humanitarian aid and assistance. In effect, it was news management. The agency is vital. Without the agency, the Palestinian refugee and other Palestinian population of concern in the occupied territory will have far less of a chance to sustain itself in the most material way possible. And the Israelis know this. And so too does the rest of the world. So a lot of those states that pulled their funding have come back and given their funding, including Canada. The United States has yet to do so, and they likely won't with a new Trump administration. But if you watch the General Assembly debate on UNRWA, which took place, I believe, last week after the Israelis passed their legislation, in the United Nations General Assembly, there was only one state arguing against UNRWA, and that was Israel. And every other state, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they issued a statement together in support of UNRWA. And a core group of states led by Belgium, a good number of states, many of them are Western states, but also from the global south, they all came to UNRWA's defense. So there is a consensus, a global consensus, that there is no alternative to UNRWA in terms of supporting the Palestinian population in the occupied territory, including the Palestinian refugee population, of course, and that UNRWA must continue to exist and be allowed to discharge its obligations in line with Israel's international legal obligations and the international legal obligations of other states within which UNRWA operates, in line with the UN Charter, etc.
But Israel will. I mean, we know they'll not respond or abide by whatever UNRWA would recommend.
They may or may not.
What would be the next?
Depends.
I mean,
yeah, they may or may not. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why this is the case. I don't want to sound overly hopeful, but within the Israeli governmental echelon, there are differences of opinion. Not on the fundamental issues, like Israel's continued presence in the occupied territory. They all agree on that. Or the fact that they should maintain that presence and impose sovereignty. But differences in how to pursue these goals. And so I can foresee, and this is a conjecture on my part, speculation to be sure, but I can foresee a huge difference of opinion between the civilian sectors of government and the Israel Defense Forces and the security sector, because they know, especially because they are physically present on the ground in the occupied West Bank, they know that without UNRWA, the situation will get a lot harder for them to manage, and it will be up to them and their troops and their divisions of troops and so on to maintain that. So it may be that they prevail on cabinet in discussions to say, hey, You pass this legislation, roll it out piecemeal, roll it out slowly. Let's go easy in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, because the cost to us will be far greater if we wipe UNRWA out altogether. I can suspect a conversation like that taking place. In the Gaza Strip, that conversation is not happening. The IDF is not engaged with UNRWA today. A month or two ago, I understood they had some low-level working contacts, but overwhelmingly they want to finish the job on the Palestinians, which means removing their access to humanitarian aid and assistance. So I can understand your skepticism, but only time will tell as to what things will look like in terms of how this legislation against UNRWA is rolled out, and just how drastic things will be. It could be that UNRWA continues its operations in a limited way in portions of areas of the West Bank, education and so on. It only requires Palestinian teachers to teach their students. They need textbooks. They have those textbooks and so on. They don't need to traverse checkpoints, that sort of thing. But overwhelmingly, like in the broad scheme of things, UNRWA's humanitarian space, the space within which it operates in the occupied territory, is going to severely be limited. That much I will say.
And how would the UN respond to that?
The UN has already started its response. So conversation in the General Assembly at the plenary level, vociferous support for UNRWA. There will be passage of resolutions this session supporting UNRWA, which basically shows that there's a unanimity among the international community on UNRWA's continued support work. The Secretary General has served Israel with notice, basically saying, look, if you persist in implementing this legislation, we're going to be on a course of conflict with you, and this may result in consequences. He wasn't clear on what those consequences were. There may be legal consequences, there may be political and diplomatic consequences. We don't know what they are. And there you have it. There's additional pressure being brought to bear, hopefully bilaterally between states and Israel in their bilateral relations. Ideally, you would have the United States support, but I suspect that's not happening or forthcoming, certainly not after the 20th of January when Trump takes office. He will want to get rid of UNRWA, to be sure. But other states that are friendly to Israel, but also supportive of UNRWA, Canada, the UK, France, and others, hopefully they will prevail on the Israelis bilaterally. But the jury is out on how this is going to pan out in weeks and months ahead. But it certainly is coming to a head, certainly in Israel's relationship with the UN.
Very good. I think we covered everything.
Sounds good. Well, I hope it's of use to you, Wissam. And
yeah, it is, and it's timely.